Hello, my name is Rick Houston, and welcome to the Scene Vault Podcast, your source for all things NASCAR history. Presented by Las Vegas Motor Speedway, America's racing showplace. You will be the first female journalist member of the NMPA Hall of Fame.
Well, I hadn't even thought of that. He said, as a journalist, there's always two sides to every story. But he said you have to remember that in racing, there's 4 to 5 sides to every story because you have the driver, the crew chief, the team owner, the sponsor, the manufacturer, and then the NASCAR.
So the Scene years.
Yeah.
What was it like being with that paper in its heyday?
Oh. It was the job I'd always dreamed of. I'd wanted to be a motorsports writer since I was 13 years old. That's all I cared anything about.
The day NASCAR and all of us associated in any way with NASCAR forget its past, that's the day we don't have any future.
All right, so Deb Williams, here about a month ago, you got some pretty big news.
Yeah.
How did you get the word that you had been elected to the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame?
Well, I had actually come away from Nashville with a cold. It was a summer cold. It was so cold in the media center at Nashville. And I didn't go to Chicago, so I was sitting at home that Friday before the Chicago street race, nursing the cold.
Yeah.
And Kelly Crandall called. Well, I thought Kelly was just calling to give me an update on the Chicago street course race since that's where she was. And we chatted for a few minutes about what had happened there. And then I said, "What can I do for you?" And she said, "No, it's what I can do for you." And I said, "What?" And she informed me then that I had been elected to the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame. And I couldn't believe it. I still can't. It seems surreal. It doesn't seem real at all. And when you look at who I'll be going in with Big Daddy Don Gartlitz and Hurley Haywood and Johnny Rutherford, never in my wildest dreams did I ever imagine anything like this.
As you look back on your career, you will be the first female journalist member of the NMPA Hall of Fame.
Well, I hadn't even thought of that.
Janet Guthrie and I believe Shirley Muldowney, you're the first female journalist. What does that mean to you?
Well, that hadn't even occurred to me.
Yeah.
It's just like somebody mentioned to me a few months ago that I was the first female to cover NASCAR on a regular basis for an international wire service, and that had never occurred to me. I hadn't even thought of that. That's stunning. That's quite an honor. And, I think back to when Ken Squire and Doc Mattioli went into the NMPA Hall of Fame. That particular night, Patty Wheeler inducted Ken Squire, and I inducted Doc Mattioli. And that night, Patty and I were the first 2 women that had ever inducted anyone into the NMPA Hall of Fame. But, that's unimaginable. What you just said, it had never even occurred to me.
I know who I look to as mentors in this sport. And, of course, you are right there at the top of the list.
I appreciate that.
Who are your mentors? Who were your mentors in the sport?
Oh, my goodness. I had so many. And, Bob, there were so many that took me under their wing and guided and coached me. There was Jim Hunter with NASCAR, Gene Granger, who did the statistical book for R.J. Reynolds, Bob Latford, who created the point system and who sold programs on the beach during the beach races in the 50s. And Bob Latford gave me a lot of instruction, like the first time I went to Daytona to cover the Daytona 500, and Bob Latford told me, he said, "Now, we know you're with United Press International here in the Carolinas, but when you go to Daytona for Speed Weeks, there are a lot of people there who do not know you, have never seen you, and he said it would help you if you would just make a name tag identifying yourself as being with UPI. because he said people want to know who the wire services are. They know that Mike Harris was with the Associated Press, but you need to make your name tag. Just little things like that. Frank V. Horn, with who was with the Norfolk Virginian Pilot and the Greensboro paper and had been with Greenville, South Carolina, and Columbia and all. He had been covering the sport for over 20 years or about that long when I came in. And he would give me guidance as to where other women that had tried to cover the sport or had covered it very briefly made mistakes. And he said, as a journalist, there's always two sides to every story. But he said, you have to remember that in racing, there's 4 to 5 sides to every story, because you have the driver, the crew chief, the team owner, the sponsor, the manufacturer, and then the NASCAR. So, and he said, you got to remember, he said, people don't tell you things because they like you. They tell you things because they have an ulterior motive. And they use us like we use them. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, let's say a crew chief is wanting a different driver. Maybe he's wanting to get rid of the driver he's got, or maybe the team owner's wanting to get rid of the driver. The driver's wanting to get rid of the crew chief. So he says that's why you always need to make the telephone calls and just don't take it from one person. And it was interesting because many years later, one of the wives of a crewman told me that she said, why you don't get called a lot like so-and-so and so-and-so. And I said, no, why? And I thought it was because I was a female. And she said, no. She said, it's because they know you're going to pick up the phone and check out their story. And said they call those other people because they know they're not going to. Yeah. And so, those were the early days. I had a wonderful state editor at United Press International, and a regional office of UPI that really backed me. Unfortunately, sometimes the regional editor and the state editor would get in arguments when I was the Charlotte bureau manager, because the regional editor would want to send me to Riverside, California to cover a race, which I did, but the state editor would say, well, what happens if we have a breaking news story in Charlotte or Western North Carolina? My person's in California covering a race. So that created some friction in there. But those were the people in my UPI days that really gave me direction. And, when the other teams, it helped that Richard Petty would talk to me in the garage, that the other veteran reporters would let me hang out with them. Because at that time, when you interviewed somebody, you interviewed them at the back of a hauler. There were no lounges in the hauler. That's where they hauled the engines. You sat on the tires behind the transporters. And the fact that veteran reporters let me sit in when there was a mini news conference behind the haulers, or they didn't shut me out at the gas pumps where you always interviewed the top 5 when they came in after a race. Richard Petty would stop and talk with me. And then Linda Petty was actually the president or head of the Winston Cup Racing Wives Auxiliary at the time. And the fact that one day the wives were preparing for their annual fashion show at Burdine's, which was right across the street at the Volusia Mall from Daytona International Speedway. And this was my first year that I covered the Speed Weeks. And I went over there. I was doing a story on Dick Brooks's wife. And Linda Petty looked at the other wives and the girlfriend said, oh, I've known Debbie since she was just this high. And it was like, okay, she's got Linda Petty's seal of approval, so we don't have to worry about her, So there's been a lot of people. People say the word I does not exist in team. Well, the word I does not exist in the word success either.
Were there people who stonewalled you because of your gender?
I had less trouble in racing than I had covering the stick and ball sports.
Really?
And I think that was because of who I worked for when I started covering racing. Yeah. I think if I had been with somebody different other than United Press International, I think there would have probably been an issue there, or somebody would have caused a problem or stonewalled or whatever. But because at that particular time you had two major wire services. You had the Associated Press and you had United Press International, and they were always competing against each other, and that's who, by those wire services, you had access to all the newspapers and radio and TV stations in the nation and actually worldwide. And so, because of that, I think I had a leg up or an advantage than I would have if I had come in with a different media form. But when I first started covering racing at New Asheville Speedway, when I worked for the Waynesville paper in Waynesville, North Carolina, there were only two of us that covered that track on a weekly basis, and that was Jim Hamer at the Asheville Citizen-Times and myself. So they were so happy to have the coverage that, I basically had carte blanche there. But I think if I had been with a different news organization, I probably would have encountered issues.
So the UPI logo on your shirt gave you a little bit of credibility, just like in the Scene days, that Scene logo on your shirt gave you credibility.
Exactly. And they also did not want to make the wire service mad because they won the coverage. And in those days, you didn't have drivers with PR people and teams with PR people. That did not exist. The only person that really kind of had a PR person was Richard Petty, and that was Hardy Duck with STP. And you had the people, you had the Goodyear, Leo Mel with Goodyear, and you had PR people with the manufacturers, and that was it, because the relationships that you built with the crew members and the crew chiefs and the team owners and the drivers, if they didn't like you, they didn't talk to you, or if they got mad at you. And so you had to build those relationships. You didn't have to schedule an appointment with a driver or a team owner days in advance. And it was just an entirely different world. So it was just like it was a beat, and it was a beat reporter, and you gained your stories and all by your relationships, and it was interesting. Gene Granger told me before I went to Daytona to cover my first Speed Weeks, he said, "You won't get your stories in the garage area." He said, "Your stories come out of the lounges and the bars at night after the track closes."
Yeah.
And, at that particular time, there were no motorhomes. There was no motorhome lot. The media, the NASCAR officials, the competitors, we all stayed in the same hotels. And, for years there in Daytona, the official media hotel that the track had was also where the NASCAR officials were, and it's where Junior Johnson teams were. So you were all seeing each other and in and out and in the lounges at the tracks. There was the only night race was one night race at Bristol, so the track closed at 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
And the latest we ever had to stay was during the Tim Richmond era when we kept waiting for the drug test to come in.
Yeah.
And we were there till 7 or 8 o'clock at night. But the hours were a little bit more sane at the racetrack than what they are now.
So the Scene years.
Yeah.
What was it like being with that paper in its heyday?
Oh. It was the job I'd always dreamed of. I'd wanted to be a motorsports rider since I was 13 years old. That's all I cared anything about. I just kind of had to take a circumvent away around it through covering ACC football and basketball and the deployment of the 82nd to Grenada. And, but it served me well because covering general news is where I learned to be a reporter. But
did you go to Grenada?
No, I covered it from Fort Bragg.
Okay, all right.
I covered the deployment of the 82nd Airborne to Grenada. So I was at Fort Bragg when they were deploying, and then covered the first wave that came back in that were in the hospital there at Fort Bragg. But, yeah, I covered them as they were shipping out or being deployed.
All right.
But I did cover Robert Kennedy's, or Robert Kennedy's son, David Kennedy's death in Palm Beach. They pulled a bunch of us in there to cover that. So, I'm part of the Dr. Jeffrey McDonald trial. So I say that in the 6 years I was with UPI, I got to cover more major stories than a lot of people get to cover in an entire career. Yeah. Because that's when I covered Richard Petty's 200th win. But back to the Scene's heydays, when I first went to work for Scene, I was there 18 years, and we were about 30,000. And then when Griggs Publishing sold it to ACBJ, American City Business Journals, we had reached probably 70,000 circulation. And then during the 10 years that I was editor of it, that's when we grew and became the largest auto racing newspaper in the United States.
Well, you hired me in the next week.
Well, yeah, we just, that's right.
In paid circulation. That's what put you right over the top.
That's right. That's right. So, we couldn't just say, we got 140,000 circulation. We were audited because in order to get the advertisers, the national advertisers, the Goodyear, the Chevrolet, all those people, they wanted proof that was our true paid subscription. And so we were audited every so often. And the auditors would just come in and pull a subscriber's name and say, let me see their canceled check. Let me see where they paid. And so we were audited till we had proof that was that circulation. But those days were just unbelievable. It was, I look back and you say NASCAR was on a speeding train growth-wise. Well, Scene was on a speeding train, too. And I look back at some of the hours that I put in when I was there, and it's like, man, I don't know how my body did that. But, I can remember one time I went in one morning at 9 o'clock, and I worked there in the office until probably 4 a.m., and there was a little place you could get breakfast at the convenience store near my house. And as I went by it, I stopped in and I told the person that was cooking, I said, I've got to go home, take a shower, pack my suitcase, and then leave for the airport because I got a 7 a.m. flight to Pocono. But I said, if you will I want a bologna and scrambled egg sandwich, and I'll pick it up on the way back. And so I went home, took a shower, packed my suitcase, stopped there. He had my sandwich ready, and then I drove to the airport. And when I got to the Pocono, I didn't even worry about dinner. I just went in, fell down on the bed, and went to sleep. But I say that was the case with Scene, but, when I was with UPI, I was on call 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And there was one time I covered 4 stories in 3 cities in 48 hours. And that night I checked into the hotel in Atlanta, and the person at the desk said, well, all I've got left is a king-size bed. Do you mind? I said, I don't care what you got, and I don't care where it is. I just want a bed. But to Scene, what made Scene so special was our camaraderie. Everybody pulled together, everybody wanted the same thing, everybody wanted to produce the best product that was possible, and we knew that the fan counted on us to give them the straight story, not the BS, not the rumors, but the straight story of what was going on in the NASCAR community. And when you've got a responsibility like that on your shoulders, yeah, it's stressful, but at the same time, man, when you saw that paper come out every week and what you had produced together as a team, it's a feeling that you always look for again and want, but it's like, man, I don't think that can ever be recreated. I think we could if we got the team back together again. I really do. But the media world has changed so much that it would be different. But I think if we got everybody back together again, we could still have that special camaraderie, special desire to do the best every single week.
I know how much the business has changed in my time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I will always have ink in my veins.
Oh, yeah. I still love the smell of that printing press.
I had the Laugh TV show, retro TV show, a couple of weeks ago that I saw. This kid was delivering newspapers, and he freaked out when he got ink from the newspapers onto his hands. That's the most beautiful feeling ever. What are you talking about? How has the business changed from the print days to now?
The biggest thing that I see and that bothers me is that with the internet, anybody can create a website. Anybody can create a YouTube channel. And,
or a podcast.
Well, yeah.
Dig your way out of that one.
Yeah, but the difference is you were a print journalist, but you are correct. Anybody can do a podcast too. But my point is that people are doing it who have never been trained in the communications business. They've never studied communications law. And, you know, they think they don't know slander, they don't know libel. They think everything's covered by the First Amendment. They don't check sources. There is so much misinformation out there. You know, if you made a mistake in a newspaper, you had to come back and correct it. You had to say, you know, this was wrong. We did this wrong. And the accountability is missing. And that's the biggest thing I see, and I think that's the biggest problem that we have nowadays is people don't know where to go to for their trusted information. They go where they hear stuff they want to hear or they like to hear, but it's not everybody is a professional journalist just because they've created something in the communications business. And that's the biggest thing I see, and the biggest thing that bothers me.
So you've won basically every award there is to win in journalism. You're now a member, when you get inducted, you'll be a member of the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame. What keeps you going? What keeps you going to the racetrack?
Just the passion for the sport. You know, something happened in June, and I thought about what you just asked me, and I was writing a story for Autoweek on Ryan Newman's daughter racing. The fact that he nearly got killed at Daytona hasn't deterred her from wanting to race. And I pulled out my 35mm camera. When I started out in the business at Waynesville, I had to do all my own photography to go with my stories. That meant shooting football games, basketball games, you know, anything that I covered, I had to do the photography to go with it. And so when I was working on this story on Brooklyn, I pulled out my 35mm digital camera and headed off to Little Dirt Track Millbridge Speedway in Salisbury. And I spent 5 hours that night interviewing and walking back and forth from the first turn, which was the best place to shoot action shots, back to the hauler. And I thought, you know, sometimes you do have to go back where you started to remember why you fell in love with something to begin with. Yeah. And when it's not fun anymore, and when it's not that passion, that love, that satisfaction anymore, then that's when I stop. I had some people I went to high school with ask me last year when I was going to retire, and I said, when I die. Because as long as I enjoy it, as long as I can do it, why retire?
Yeah. Well, it can't get much better than that. Anything else you'd like to add?
I'm just going to have to do a blanket thank you to everybody who has held a part in my career, because if I listed everyone from the first editor I had when I was in high school, well, actually junior high when I was on the school newspaper, all the way up, we would be here for 2 days.
Yeah.
So it's, and I'm happy some of those people are going to be able to come. Unfortunately, a lot of them are no longer with us.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's like I told the paper where I started the other day, you know, it goes back to a good family foundation, a good community. We had a great education system where I grew up, and all of that. It's been a building process. So I just want to say thank you to everybody, from the teachers that had to put up with me when I was, as my mother said, a spirited child.
Surely not.
Well, it was funny when I took care of her the last 3 years of her life, and I told her, I said, Mama, I'm sorry I caused you so much trouble when I was growing up. She said, oh, you weren't that bad. You were just spirited.
That's awesome.